Starting off with George, take 3 to 5 minutes and just give an opening statement on how you see the basic topic of today dealing with the is bankruptcy inevitable for the Chicago Public Schools. George Panagakis.
All right. So our time allotment was just cut in half. I thought I had 5 to 10 minutes to describe everything you needed to know about Chapter 9. I'm kidding. We'll get it done in 5 minutes.
Guy must be a lawyer.
So what is Chapter 9? We'll cut right to the chase. Chapter 9 is a chapter of the Bankruptcy Code that deals with municipal bankruptcies, and the Chicago public school system would be a municipality for that purpose. So most people are not familiar with Chapter 9, but you might have had some greater familiarity with Chapter 7 or Chapter 11 or Chapter 13. So just to kind of get some vocabulary out there. Chapter 7 is a liquidation. A person or a corporation goes to Chapter 7 in order to liquidate. Chapter 11 is typically where a corporation goes to reorganize. And a Chapter 13 is typically where an individual will go to restructure his or her debts. And there's a huge difference between what goes on in a Chapter 9 case and what goes on in a Chapter 7 or 11 or 13. And one of the biggest differences is how little involvement the bankruptcy court actually has in the conduct of a Chapter 9 case. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that. But one thing to understand up front is that the Chicago public school system or any municipality maintains control of their destiny even after they file for Chapter 9. That's very, very different than the input that a whole bunch of parties have in a Chapter 7 or an 11 or a 13. And as we go through this, because it's at least loosely analogous to compare a Chapter 9 to a Chapter 11, I'll make some references back and forth to a business reorganization versus a municipal reorganization. So to kind of sum up everything that at least I plan on talking about, I think that there's I narrowed it down to 3 topics. First is eligibility criteria. And that's getting a lot of press right now. That's the constitutional issue that's sometimes talked about, and it's got some other practical aspects. So I want to talk about what does it take to be eligible to file for Chapter 9 to begin with. Then I want to talk a little bit about what happens in a Chapter 9. And in case I run out of time, the answer there is going to be not very much happens in a Chapter 9 that's not consensual. And then I'm going to give a little data on what's happened in some of the other Chapter 9 bankruptcies that have filed across the country of late. And there haven't been many, whereas there have been tens of thousands of Chapter 11 cases that have filed. I think there's been a total of 600 municipal cases that have filed in the last 100 years. So the body of precedent is very, very different. So the eligibility criteria first. In order for a municipality to file for bankruptcy, they have to meet 4 criteria. The first one is different than the other 3. The first one is what I'll call the constitutional issue. The short answer is there's no municipality in Illinois that can file for Chapter 9. It would currently be illegal. The state of Illinois would have to act first and pass legislation that would permit municipalities to file for Chapter 9. And right now, Illinois is among about half the states in the union that do not have that legislation. So there's still a lot to talk about. Don't go running out, just because we can't use Chapter 9. There's still plenty to talk about, and there's a lot of people that are talking about passing that type of legislation. Whether it's realistic or not, I leave to others to weigh in on. But right now, it's not a tool that's available. For those that have an interest in the Constitution, just real briefly, the reason for that is Article 1 of the Constitution says that bankruptcy is a matter of federal law. When you go into a bankruptcy court, the judge is a federal employee, and he or she is dispensing federal law. The Constitution also has the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment says any right that was not specifically given to the federal government is reserved to the states. And one of the rights that was not given to the federal government was the right for states and municipalities to govern their own internal affairs. So with what I said earlier, in a Chapter 11, there's a lot of meddling that goes on by the bankruptcy court and other parties that what could happen in a typical bankruptcy conflicts with the rights that are reserved by the states in the 10th Amendment. And so the way that this has been harmonized is the bankruptcy code has as its first eligibility criteria, no municipality could go into bankruptcy unless the state has first okayed it. And so that's why you need the state legislation to actually give the power to the federal government to somewhat interfere with municipal affairs. And I'll say that when states do this, a state could do it however it wants to. But when a state adopts that type of legislation, they don't typically give carte blanche to the municipality and say, all right, go file for bankruptcy and do whatever you want to do. Oftentimes, and it doesn't have to be this way, but oftentimes there's a process where the municipality might need to come to the state first and explain why it wants to use Chapter 9. And again, often it doesn't have to be this way. The process would involve the governor appointing what's called an emergency manager. And it's that unelected emergency manager that would actually oversee the bankruptcy process. It doesn't have to be this way. The state could pass whatever legislation it wants to pass. What I'm describing is, say, what happened in Michigan when Detroit filed for bankruptcy. There was legislation that permitted, before Detroit could file for bankruptcy, there was a process that had to be run through, and there was an emergency manager that was appointed who's kind of like me, a bankruptcy person, not an elected official. So anyway, that's the constitutional issue. I think what's more important is the other three eligibility criteria. And those go more to the practical dynamics of what does the situation really need to look like before a municipality could file for bankruptcy, even if you had the state enabling legislation. And here I'm going to do my first comparison to a Chapter 11. We could file a company for Chapter 11 in a weekend. It's, if you were in a crisis. If you had 2, 3, 4 weeks, you could actually make it a pretty filing and get all your ducks in a row and make it a smoother filing. In a Chapter 9, it is not that way at all. There are a lot of things that need to be done before a municipality could even enter bankruptcy. And these are the other three eligibility criteria.
George, you're running on incredibly lenient. Judge Zago will be proud of me, but could you sum it up?
Sum it up, okay. So, got the point. The three eligibility criteria. Number one, you actually have to be insolvent. And that's going to be litigated, whether the city or the municipality could raise more taxes or cut more expenses. And you have to be insolvent in a near-term cash flow basis. So you have to really, really be out of money. Number two, you have to have, the school district would have to have a plan. This is what I want to do to get out of bankruptcy. You can't go into a Chapter 9 blindly. And number three, you have to have tried to have negotiated with your creditors and to have obtained a consensus amongst the majority of your creditors. You have to, all three of those need to be satisfied, or you're not in Chapter 9. And those eligibility criteria often takes a year or longer for a bankruptcy judge to litigate. And until those are resolved, the Chapter 9 hasn't even started. So I'll leave it with that. Let other folks talk, and I'll get the other.
Very good. Before we go to our next speaker, I don't know, I may be the only one that got a little confused. You keep saying municipality. Is the Board of Education or CPS considered a municipality?
Yeah, a municipality is basically any political subdivision that gets money by the raising of taxes and is run by elected officials as opposed to people chosen by shareholders. So the answer is yes. And there have been a few school districts among the 600 that have filed for bankruptcy in the past.
What if they're not elected?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, that's it. Got it.
That was
I'm sure all of you caught it. I just was trying to catch up. All right. Jesse, you're on.
Well, thank you. And that's all that's being said. And George, I, for one, am a corporate lawyer and it's not a bankruptcy, so I appreciated the primer on Chapter 9 bankruptcies. I've dealt with some Chapter 11s in my career, but not 9s. And as long as I'm on the school board, I never will. And I trust that no municipality in this state will ever have to deal with Chapter 9, and it's not even a matter of existence in this state, and it shouldn't be, because there are ways to move forward. But before you move forward, you got to understand where you came from, and so briefly, just want to touch upon some of those things of why are we here? Because all that said, you got to have, as George mentioned, you have to have a plan, regardless of a Chapter 9, and so we have to have a plan to move forward, and there are several plans out there. But looking back, how we got here, and obviously we've got Paul here, who will touch upon some of the things that happened at CPS now 20 years ago, and looking back in that 20-year, and Tribune wrote about some of that over the weekend. But the fact of the matter is, state support for public education has been in decline. Now, I also was on the State Board of Education from 04 to 11. Just a coincidence, 04 to 11, education funding was going up. And in 11, it started coming down. Then we had the Great Recession. Thank God for ERA funds. We were able to support state school districts in the state, but that support ended. And, over the past, since fiscal 10, we've lost $500 million because of declining state support of public education. And in this past year alone, from last fiscal year to the budget we'll vote on tomorrow, it'll be a $100 million decrease. And we're not, for those who are familiar with EFAB, we're not anywhere near EFAB levels. EFAB's this lofty goal of what we should be providing folks that we can say it's an adequate education in the state of Illinois. We're $1 billion away from funding EFAB. Pension equity, that's something that we've talked about a lot, and it's true that CPS is the only district in the state of Illinois that doesn't have its pension payment covered by the state. We do get some money. It's about $62 million a year. But as it was noted this past year, that obligation was about $700 million. So back in fiscal year 95, state support for CPS was about 23% of what it was doing for TRS. So 62 million versus the 267 it was paying TRS back then. This past year, we went down to 1.7%. So 23% versus 1.7% of what we as Chicagoans and our CPS students are getting. So in this next fiscal year, just to put it in terms of what we're able to do for students, that means every student outside of Chicago will receive $2,266 from the state of Illinois to support their education and pay their teachers' pension fund. In Chicago, each student will get $31. I'm getting choked up just saying it. $31. $31, almost a differential of 200 times that we're getting shortchanged in the city of Chicago. So once we achieve pension equity, that will help a great deal. And if we have those payments taken care of, that'll be about $200 million more, even if it's only normal cost, into CPS. And of course, we have a growing pension liability, and that's been didn't happen overnight, been long in the making. It's about $9.4 billion. Chuck, I'm sure you'll fine-tune that number. But that's a number of pension holidays over the years. And Paul can talk about in those years, it was 100% funded, and they didn't need to make the payments. Whether or not philosophically we should or shouldn't, even when you're at 100%, Chuck will, I'm sure, address that. There was asset underperformance and then changes in some actuarial assumptions. So we've been underfunding, now it's catch-up time, and that catch-up time is the crux of our problems. And as well as diminishing state support. And in doing that, we've grown our debt, because what we've tried to do, and other boards before us have tried to do, is keep cuts away from the classroom. So how do you do that? You borrow. Is it the wisest thing in the world to do? That can be debated, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those questions here this afternoon. But we've done that to keep cuts away from the classroom. Meanwhile, we get our structural issues fixed at the state level. And so we're going to continue to restructure that debt. We'll have additional votes on that tomorrow. And just of note, swaps did not create this problem. Back in 2003, again, this is, it would have been 8 years before I ever got on the state board, the school board in Chicago. The board at that time thought it was wise, and in that time, it may have been wise to go forward and pursue that means of financing. Obviously, in hindsight, you can always second guess those things, and we're working through and getting out of all those contracts, but that's not the cause of this issue. And folks may want to mention that and bring that up as a cause of why we're here, but that's a drop in the bucket of the total $9.4 billion obligation we've got. So where do we go from here? We move forward by working with our partners in Springfield. There's a bill pending. Senate President Cullerton has a bill who would give us our normal costs and hopefully additional funding that would help us close our budget shortfall this year, which gets us to adequate and equitable funding in the state of Illinois, not just for Chicago, but for all districts. I'm the CPS representative on the Illinois Association of School Boards that met in town this past weekend. And so, glutton for punishment, I spent my 3 hours of my Sunday afternoon inside the Hyatt at a IASB board meeting, and it was universal. Everybody's talking about this. The IASB is represented by school board members from across the entire state, north to south, east to west, and they all universally have funding problems. So it's not unique to Chicago.
Jesse, wrap
Yes.
it up.
And so you've got partners in Springfield that need to help us. We as Chicagoans need to step forward and propose additional revenue sources and other partners. But those shouldn't be legislated. Those should be negotiated at the negotiation table. And so we won't go bankrupt. So the discussion is informative, but it's not going to be practical because we've got to work our way through this through fixing our structural issues and working with our partners to make sure that we have a sound footing going forward.
Very good. Thank you, Jesse. Chuck, you're up.
Thanks much, Paul. In my 5 minutes or less, I'm trying to hit on 5 points. I think most of it is covered by George. Really, the talk about bankruptcy is really a red herring. You know, that's not the issue. The real issue is education, education funding, education policy, and talking about bankruptcy, introducing legislation that allows for bankruptcy. You know, this is all just kind of just a delay that just doesn't address the core issue of education and education policy and education funding. You know, it's important to know when you talk about education funding, you're also talking about pension funding. You know, pensions are part of education. Jane Addams, I think, was the president of the school board back in like 1907. And she noted even back then that, you know, pensions are not Christmas club accounts. They're not Ponzi schemes. Pensions are part of your compensation. And when a teacher goes to work, their pensions should be funded on an actuarial basis, and they should be paid for at the time those services are delivered. So really, when we're talking about trying to solve the pension issues, we really have to go back and solve the education issues. And this is a much larger discussion than even just education funding, because there's a lot going on in education over the years. Third point that I'd like to make is really that it's really reprehensible that the state would even consider bankruptcy for Chicago Public Schools or any entity, because reality is, you know, the state made this game. You know, they control everything, and for them to try to insulate themselves through their statute and saying that, you know, if the CPS goes bankrupt, state's not responsible for anything. It's just wrong. You know, Chicago Public Schools is an entity. It's a creation of the state. The state really controls almost every aspect of education, from charter schools to curriculum to testing to taxes. You know, this is really a creature of the state, and the state needs to step up and take responsibility for it. Well, thanks. I should have just made this 3 items.
Chuck, if you want to stop there, you're ahead.
Okay. Well, the fourth item really is, you know, the state can't solve this by kicking the can down the road. You know, you don't solve a problem created by kicking the can down the road by kicking it further down the road. You know, the next person that's come along is not going to have bigger shoes. They're not going to have more options. It's not like there's miraculously something that's going to happen to give them some new options. So even in Senate Bill 318, where Senator Cullerton, with all due respect, is proposing just, in his words, a partial holiday, you know, even a partial holiday is unacceptable. You think about what that holiday does for the citizens of Chicago. So it's only a $540 million holiday over 2 years, but in terms of what it's going to cost to get the pension fund up to 90% funding during that subsequent period, it's a $6 billion tax increase. You know, only $500 million holiday, $6 billion in additional revenues will be required to get to 90% funding. It's the classic, if you're out of my generation, it's the Fram Oil commercial. You pay us now or you pay us later. And the price tag later just goes up tremendously. So kicking the can down the road is not an option. Senate Bill 318 should be amended if it's being considered, because now really is the time to address these issues, to just pick the can up and deal with education properly. You know, you've got a Republican governor, Democratic legislature. You know, all the parties are to blame for this in the past. All the parties need to be involved in the solution. And for us, and when it looks at in terms of pensions, what Senate Bill 318 starts but doesn't finish is you need to take discretion out of pension funding. You know, basically, pensions work if the employer puts in the required amount, the actuarial amount. You look in state after state, even look in Illinois, and you look at the pension funds where the employer is required to make a contribution. Those funds are well-funded. The benefits aren't under threat or to be diminished or anything like that. So the plan, and this really is the last point, that we need to deal with this. Discretion is not an option, and we need to take that away from CPS and make a mandatory employer contribution required. And I just want to note, you know, this is the 120th anniversary of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. It's the oldest pension fund in the state, second oldest in the nation, I believe. You know, it survived 2 world wars, depressions, you know, gold standard being eliminated. You know, pensions can survive a lot of things, but it can't survive is optional employer contributions.
Okay. Troy, before we get to you, a little pop quiz. Ed Mazer, you're not allowed to answer this question. Who was the Chicago mayor in 1905? Sure. City Club of Chicago, right on target.
Daley?
Not Daley. Guys picked a good man here, I'll tell you. Yeah. Edward F. Dunn, and what's his greatest accomplishment? The only mayor who's gone on to allegedly higher office. He became governor. Okay, class over. Troy, you're up.
Good afternoon, beautiful people. In order to stay within time limits for the first time in my life, I will be speaking from prepared remarks. Thanks to City Club for inviting me here. Unfortunately, I could not partake in the meal because I am fasting today in solidarity with the 12 parents and community members who are in their 9th day of a hunger strike in order to get CPS to just listen to them in their proposal to save the last public neighborhood open enrollment high school in the city. So this gesture on my part is relatively insignificant when compared to the sacrifice they are making, but it's a gesture I make nonetheless. As residents and taxpayers, we have to do more than identify problems. We have to identify and understand the source of those problems. If we don't neutralize that source, then we might be able to solve the problem today, but that source will rear its head a few years down the line and recreate the same havoc that it's creating today. For example, we've been told that pensions are the problem. Indeed, we have problems with pensions, but pensions are not the source of our problem. This administration consistently misappropriated pension funds and then attempts to convince us that pensions themselves are the problem. That's like a thief stealing your rent money and then attempting to convince you that the landlord is your problem. The source of our problem is the city and school officials who raise, spend, and borrow money in a manner that is reckless and corrupt. The source of our problem is the parasitic private sector banks and investors who are always looking for creative ways to rip off taxpayers. The source of our problem are state legislators who are all too eager to create a legislative climate that makes it easy for this kind of nonsense to happen. Since I don't have time to deal with all 3 of those, I'm going to focus on the reckless borrowing and the banks who benefit from it. It's interesting to note that when the Tribune attempted to get the details about how CPS spends, how much it spends in interest on its massive debts, that CPS stalled and made them and their attorneys work for a year to get that information. So not only are they putting us deeper in debt, they're working overtime to hide from us how much debt they're putting us into. CPS recently hired Ernst & Young to do an analysis of their structural deficit. The analysis shows that pension costs are projected to rise only 32% over 7 years, while debt service is projected to rise 350% over those same 7 years, from 119 million to well over 400 million. This is the debt that's driving up costs. And this debt is not owed to teachers or retirees. This debt is owed to financial institutions like the Pritzker Group, Goldman Sachs, and Northern Trust, all Emmanuel campaign contributors. And his administration wants to make sure that they get paid everything they're owed. This debt is owed to banks and investors who virtually swindled CPS out of over $100 million. Financial institutions like Bank of America and the Royal Bank of Canada. They have documented evidence that these banks knew that the auction rate securities market was going to collapse, and at the same time that they were preparing a huge, massive auction rate issue for CPS. This is illegal. You can sue them for this and get your money back. But the Emmanuel administration refuses. They want these banks to get every dime they're owed, even though they got it through corrupt and deceptive practices. The administration wants to pay your tax dollars to everyone they owe, except one group. The only people the Emmanuel administration doesn't want to pay what it owes are teachers. Let me say that another way. The only group of people this administration doesn't want to pay just happen to be the only group of people who actually worked for what they're owed. Spent their entire careers working and sacrificing for what CPS owes them. PNC Bank didn't sacrifice a more lucrative career to dedicate itself to teaching science and mathematics. Chicago's teachers do that. Goldman Sachs didn't sacrifice time with their own families to stay after school to tutor struggling readers. Chicago teachers do that. None of these institutions spent years working with 4 struggling students in hopes that this sacrifice and investment of time would pay off on graduation day, only to have those hopes destroyed when news reaches you that you'll be preparing instead to attend their funerals.
Troy, you're a little over 5 minutes, so a lot
told
over
me
5
10,
minutes,
brother.
so sum it up. You're on a roll.
This happens as a result of the neglect in their communities by many of the same people who are neglecting their schools. I must say a few of their names. Miguel, Tyree, Roberto, and Candace. And teachers all over this city have their own list of names that are etched into their hearts as a result of their sacrifices. As our teachers feel this district coming in to take what little they get in return for their sacrifice, this administration's hollow, empty, and hypocritical use of the term shared sacrifice to justify this encroachment must seem profoundly disrespectful and painfully ironic. To reiterate, as I close, the source of our problem is one, city and school officials who raise and spend and borrow money in a manner that is reckless and corrupt, the parasitic private sector, banks and investors who are always looking for creative ways to rip off taxpayers, and the state legislators who are eager to create a legislative environment in which this legalized theft can occur. If anyone is made to sacrifice, it has to be members of these 3 groups. Because the behavior of teachers didn't cause this problem. The behavior of the people in these 3 groups caused this problem. Teachers have already made their sacrifice 1,000 times over. And those whose behavior caused this sacrifice have no right to ask them for any more.
All right. Okay. Paul, aren't you happy I said you're batting 5th? Former CEO, Chicago Public Schools, Paul Vallas.
Well, now you know why they had Troy bat cleanup. Obviously, he saw a lot of fastballs, so he didn't need me to back him up. But let me just make, let me preface my remarks by saying I believe that historically schools have been funded in this state, and there is a double standard. Chicago has been discriminated against on the pension side, and I believe that the state has consistently kicked the can down the road. And I believed it so strongly that I tried to have Pat Quinn get elected governor. So I like to think that I've certainly been doing my part. But let me just, the first question is the bankruptcy issue. Bankruptcy is not the option. The legal obstacles, the implications, the fact that the courts are going to force you to demonstrate that you've done everything that you could normally do in a normal political environment to resolve the issues before they declare bankruptcy. It's just not an option just for those reasons alone. But it's also not an option because who wants to send their kids to a bankrupt school district? You have to understand that part of the problem, part of the financial impact challenges facing the schools today is the fact that they've been losing student population. When we ran the schools from 95 to 2001, Gary Chico and the School Reform Board, the enrollment actually increased by 30,000 because the schools were stable, things were happening, new schools were being built, issues were being addressed. That probably generated between $200 to $300 million annually in additional revenue. So by growing, we were actually generating more money. Well, if you declare bankruptcy in this district, the litigation that would follow, the strikes that would probably occur, you would totally destabilize the system, which means people would flock away from the system, which means you would put the system in a financial death spiral. So at the end of the day, bankruptcy is literally the kiss of death because the average daily attendance and the school funding formula is based on the number of students and their average daily attendance, and that would decimate the finances. So it's simply not an option. There are two problems as I see it. There's the pension problem, there's the operating deficit problem. The pension problem is a political problem. The seeds to a compromise are there. The state picks up normal cost. You restore the pension levy. You do some compromise, either immediate or long-term on the pension pickup. You actually make a commitment that all TIF surpluses and all uncommitted future TIF property tax levies will be deposited, at least half will be deposited into the retirement system. Remember, these long-term projections are 30-year projections. They are projecting out 30 years. 30 years, that will have an impact. And if you do those things and you make the deposits in a timely manner so Chuck doesn't have to liquidate pension assets in order to pay the bills because he's getting his getting his payment at the end of the year, you could probably go to the legislature and get some support for adjusting the payment schedule so you could address the issue and then turn your attention to the operating budget. That's the strategy. And that is a political issue. That is a political compromise. And holding local government issues like the pension funding issue, or for that matter, Cook County Board President Preckwinkle's pension reform issue hostage because you're trying to press the state to make concessions on labor issues is just fundamentally unfair. Don't interfere with local governments. You got a battle to fight at the state level, fight that battle, but address the needs of local governments because so many of the problems that exist today because of the state policies that have adversely impacted local governments. Now, let's talk about the operating deficit. If you're going to attack the operating deficit, you've got to look at the operating deficit as a programmatic, organizational, and structural issue. If you go on the website, the CPS website, there's 17 categories of spending. If you look at each of those categories of spending, there are probably more efficient, more effective models, more cost-effective models that you could bring in each of those categories that would save you significant money while at the same time not necessarily having a detrimental effect on services. The problem with government is sometimes we attack a problem of a labor-intensive government by simply cutting people. And that just makes the government more inefficient rather than looking at alternate models. And certainly if I had another 10 minutes, I could give you 3 or 4 examples of what could be done in that area. But the bottom line is what's important is if you can separate the pension issue from the operating budget issue, you now have a 8 to 10% budget problem, structural problem, not a 20% structural problem. And that is a similar problem to the problem that we faced in 1995 when the mayor got control of the schools. We had about a 7 to 8% structural deficit. Now, that said and done, that would be great. The political problems get resolved. On the pension side, the state does what it's supposed to do. A reasonable compromise is reached. And on the operating side, you balance the budget by making structural and programmatic and organizational changes. But what happens? 3 or 4 years, new leadership comes in, people start making the same bad decisions that got us into this mess in the first place. In 2001, the district had $1.2 billion in cash reserves. They had 12 bond rating upgrades. They had a fully funded pension system. They had 6 years of structurally balanced budgets. They had no deficit. They had no debt from borrowing. The only debt was general obligation bond debt, and that was at 4%. That was at 4%. That was in 2001. That was the first phase of Mayder's reforms. Why did that happen? It happened because there were basic rules that were established. And I'm citing these basic rules because these are the rules that need to be adopted now going forward. So even if Forrest Claypool and the board are successful at stabilizing the district's finances, are we going to face the same issue 5 or 6 or 7 years from now? And let me tell you, Forrest Claypool is the best manager that the mayor could have appointed to run the school district. Hands down an efficient and a very effective manager. But those rules are as follows. Number one, you need to do long-term budget planning. When we prepared our first budget in 1995, we didn't approve it until we could guarantee that it could be balanced in 2001. You need to manage your capacity. You don't open schools and create a greater capacity only to turn around and then close schools claiming that you're at overcapacity. You discipline yourself so that you're not borrowing, you're not spending stimulus money like it's one-time money. You're not deferring obligations. You negotiate collective bargaining agreements that you can pay for. Not collective bargaining agreements that you're going to have to defer obligations in order to finance. And then finally, when you make a commitment like we did in 1995 in writing, that if the pension funding levels would fall below full funding, that we would restore the levy, you keep that commitment. You don't break it in 2004 and then go and try to get legislation to extend the holiday for another 3 years, and then attempt to do it in 2013. So at the end of the day, what's really important is that, number one, you address the political issue of the pensions. Number two, that you address the management issues of designing a long-term financial plan that is actually a school improvement vehicle. And then number three, you institute some fundamental protections that will ensure that these bad practices never happen again, because they're the same bad practices that have gotten the city into trouble. It's as if the city exploited their bad financial practices and borrowing and deferring obligations or selling assets and using those assets to balance 2 or 3 budgets, and then the revenue from those assets are gone. Those same practices were extended to the school district. So I've suggested a couple things. First, that they reinstate the school finance authority to oversee and to approve the budgets and to bring greater transparency to the budget process. They need to know. Somebody needs to hold the district accountable, and not just the political accountability that comes at the end of the day, 5 years down the road when you're broke and you're in crisis. Accountability needs to be constant. And then secondly, I have said that I believe that you need a mixed board. I believe that there needs to be at-large representation at the board, because there needs to be a check and balance. And through a mixed board, you get greater transparency. You get greater transparency and greater access to information. So those are the suggestions I've made. Thank you.
All right, round of applause. By the way, you can see I went to Chicago Public Schools. Notice how strict I was in that 3 to 5 minute thing. For all you folks, tough crowd. Well, we still have time for some questions, but not many. But however, I think if he wants to, Jesse, you want to respond to any of this, or do you want to just go to the question?
I'm sorry?
You want to respond to some of the things that they're saying about that board that you nobly serve on?
No, I'll be happy to take it in questions. So.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, we have someone, the who's who. We could have the people who ask the questions. Okay, come up here and you give your view. Lawrence Massal, raise your hand. Civic Federation. Printed, by the way. You can tell he's an experienced question writer. Since the state legislature controls the benefits and pension funding requirements, what is the policy or other benefits Chicago taxpayers, teacher or retirees of Chicago not joining every other school district as part of the state teachers retirement system?
These aren't in order of importance, but it's important to note that when Jane Addams set up the current situation in '07, she set up a member-directed pension board, and that's in the statute and possibly constitutionally protected. So the question would be, would you rather have a pension board that's run by representatives of the populace or by representatives that are essentially appointed by the governor? And as we've seen with the downstate teacher retirement system, their funding ratio is at least 10 points worse than ours. Their return on investments is poorer than ours over a 10, 20-year period. I think if you look through the Tribune's archives, you'll find more scandals related to downstate teachers' pension funds investment practices. You'll see less services provided locally to teachers and perhaps even less investment locally. So basically, Chicago teachers provide their services in Chicago. They're the pillars of the Chicago community. And their money, which pension funds are, it's their money, and it's put to work in the Chicago area. So I think there's a variety of reasons why you would not want to be combined with the downstate teachers pension fund.
All right, any other? By the way, we just broke, Chuck, you just broke a record. It's the most time Jane Addams' name has been mentioned in the City Club since 1903. All right. She was a member, and I can give you all kinds of, we don't have time. Tom Donovan, right in front. Question. I think this should probably go to you, Mr. Panagakis. Governor Rauner has said that CPS should file bankruptcy. After hearing Mr. Panagakis, do any of the panelists think that Governor Rauner has studied what bankruptcy for CPS could entail, or do more to go, or do they think it is political rhetoric, a red herring? Oh, George, you seem to know a
Okay,
little about this.
I have to assume he's a smart guy. He studied it, but maybe not. Listen, nobody. Let me say that nobody wants to file for bankruptcy. Not a business, not a person, not a corporation. It's bad for everything. You don't want to file for bankruptcy. The question is, if you've run out of other alternatives and you haven't achieved the consensus that everyone is trying to articulate here and elsewhere, if you can't achieve the consensus that you need outside of bankruptcy, well, better than actually going bankrupt might be to file for bankruptcy, use that forum, get everyone together, and try your one last-ditch effort to try to, to straighten out the situation. So I actually think it's okay to talk about Chapter 9. It's okay to understand what it means and what the eligibility criteria are, and to kind of go into it with more knowledge, even if it's a remote tool to use. Because if you're in that death spiral, which you kind of need to be to file for Chapter 9, I think at that point in time you might be thankful that you at least have that tool before you go actually bankrupt.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Well, slightly different take on it is that I think it's a total abdication on the governor's part and our other partners in Springfield, if that's what they're recommending, and so far it's only the governor. But I think it's an abdication of their duties and shirking of their responsibilities to the students of Chicago. And so, frankly, I think it's irresponsible to even talk about it.
Just one last point. There is this emergency manager notion, so I don't want to be dismissive of that. But the Chicago public school system would be the one making the choice to file for bankruptcy. It's not the governor. All they could do is pass the legislation. So it is the municipality that makes the choice. If you're in a bankruptcy proceeding, only the municipality could put forth a plan that gets you out of bankruptcy. You can't liquidate a municipality. There are a lot of limitations on what creditors can do. And I was going to say at the outset, I know there was a lot of discussion about protecting retiree benefits. And I can't say I perfectly canvassed this. So I'm going to grossly overly generalize. But if you look at the municipalities that have filed, the bondholders take by far the biggest haircut. The retirees take by far the lowest haircut and often no haircut whatsoever. And the current, working employees, they fall somewhere in between, but they are far away from the bondholders. So again, if it's the Chicago public school system that views this as its tool to implement any plan that, it wants to implement, I think it's a tool worth considering, but not as something to kind of throw around in kind of an uninformed way.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing, and I want to reiterate my point that the adverse impact bankruptcy would have on the stability of the system, because while when cities file for bankruptcy, people can't just flood and move out of the city at once, but you have options. You have school options. You have different options. You have charter schools. You have private schools, et cetera. And when there's instability and the implications of bankruptcy, because once again, you don't have like stakeholders. I mean, stakeholders are the teachers, the employees. Ultimately, in a municipal bankruptcy, would probably suffer the most. And if there are the resulting strikes and work stoppages and things like that, that only further destabilizes the system, drives children away, which only worsens the financial crisis that the district is facing. So that's a significant
And I
downside.
just whispered to George that, what we're forgetting we have a lot of vendors who help us run the district. Food, there are more than 1 million meals served. Those are unsecured creditors. I don't think those folks are going to come and provide any services when they're going to be, not paid. And so, again, death spiral, it's not enough.
Okay, we're running out of time, and we have three, I'm combining two of the questions, but Sharon Alter, raise your hand, Sharon, so they all can, there you are. Former college professor, so obviously she gets some clout here. That's the word we no longer use in the age of reform. Right, Charlie? Question from Sharon. How can CPS look to the Illinois General Assembly and Governor Rauner when they have a dysfunctional relationship that is deeper than partisan politics? Nice question, Sharon. I'll repeat it. How can CPS look to the Illinois General Assembly and Governor Rauner when they have a dysfunctional relationship that is deeper than partisan politics? Or put another way, Lawrence Massalas here, how can you give up drinking by going to a bar? They got their own problems. Anyone want to handle that?
Sure. I mean, I don't have my copy of the Illinois Constitution on me, but I believe the Constitution in the state of Illinois states that the state has primary responsibility for providing for the public education of the children of Illinois. And so if they meant it when they raised their right hand and took their oath of office that they were going to support the Constitution of this state, then they'll do their jobs and support the children of this state.
Good answer, Jesse. Not that the moderator will jump in, but there also is a constitutional requirement to have a balanced budget. Boy, the moderator's on a roll. You don't realize it. All right, enough of it. Last combination questions. We have Mary Sharon Riley. Where are you, Mary Sharon? All right, you got a fan club right there. And we got Dave Schaefer. Where are you, Dave? Okay. Both of them are basically talking about property taxes to pay for schools, especially in the suburban districts. Those of you who live in the suburbs or used to live in the suburbs, your property tax basically is 60 to 70% goes for schools. I don't know what it is in Chicago, but Lawrence, correct me, property tax goes for the debt, and they have the schools have their own property tax levy, but the city can't use that levy, their levy for schools. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're separate levies.
Separate levies.
Chicago, it's about 49%. It's a little over 50 if we include the city colleges.
Okay. So the question is, everyone's talking about raising property taxes. Is that the salvation, especially for those people who don't want to get reelected, is that the salvation to get us out of this financial problem?
I mean, we raised, I hate to admit it, but for those of you who live in Chicago, I've been a part of raising your property taxes for the last 4 years. We raise it every year that we've had that. We'll do it again this year. It'll get us an additional $80 million, I believe, this year. Typically, it's about 50, because we have a cap. We can't just endlessly raise it. So we raised to the cap the last 4 years, starting in 2011. Prior boards at CPS didn't necessarily do that, and so they forewent that opportunity to raise those additional revenues, and thus you get further into debt. And so we have done that, but there's got to be other revenue sources as well that augment that because we have a cap.
Well, that sort of closes it out. How about a big round of applause
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.